All right. Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome to Amnesty International and Fight for the Future's sixth Salon on the implications of web3 technologies for human rights and activism. I can't believe that we've been doing these for 6 months now. It's been so great, and thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Leah Holland, Campaigns and Communications Director with Fight for the Future. I use she or they pronouns, and I'm based in Portland, Oregon. So first, quickly, just a couple of house rules for the chat if you're joining us via Zoom. 1, assume good intentions from those you're interacting with and our speakers. We're here to have a conversation and learn. 2, treat folks with basic respect and decency. And 3, no spam, but posting relevant resources is totally welcome. And panelists, I'll give you a little 4-minute warning for your initial presentations, just to make sure that we have a good portion of this event reserved for questions and conversation. And with that, I'll introduce our subject, regulating Web3. With different proposals flying around Washington, D.C. and many states, a new lawsuit challenging financial surveillance, and the U.S. setting the stage for how new technology might develop for good or for ill, there's a lot to consider when it comes to how government might shape the next generation internet and the role activism has to play in shaping such regulations. With human rights analysis, intersectional thought, and input from traditionally marginalized communities, the U.S. government could usher in the protections everyday people need to engage in emerging technologies. Or they could mandate surveillance backdoors into every project with an element of decentralization or a blockchain component. They could, as legislation proposed this spring would do, create the legal basis to criminalize anyone who contributes to an open source software project like Tor or Firefox. Or they could mandate that the promises of decentralization are kept, so that big crypto actors can't go back on their promises of being owned by their users. As I said, there are many ideas flying around for good and for ill. What we can be sure of is that activist voices are needed when it comes to how the government regulates the next version of the internet. I'm so grateful to the panelists joining us to share their thoughts on regulation's benefits and missteps as it confronts emerging technologies today. Michael with Amnesty, who I usually hand the mic to at this point, had an unavoidable matter come up. And so while Amnesty is still hosting us, this is a Fight for the Future led event this month. And so I'll hand the screen off to S.A. Ojo, my colleague at Fight for the Future, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you all so much for joining us. My name is S.A., and as Leah said, I'm a campaigner with Fight for the Future. And I'm super thrilled to be introducing our amazing panelists today. We'll be hearing from 4 speakers. First, Sheila Warren, the Chief Executive Officer with Crypto Council for Innovation. And then Abraham Sutherland, Adjunct Professor at University of Virginia School of Law, Advisor at the Proof of Stake Alliance, and Fellow at Coin Center. Stefen Deleveaux, President, Caribbean Blockchain Alliance, and Evan Greer, Fight for the Future. Each panelist will speak for a few minutes and then we'll have an extended Q&A. So please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat. And as Leah said, always assume good intentions. And now we'll start off with Sheila.
Thank you, Estee. Thank you, Leah. It's an honor to be here today with these esteemed panelists to talk about this topic, which is very close to my heart. So I've been given 3 minutes. I'm going to fly through a little bit of framing content before I hand it over to other speakers who are going to, I think, talk about more specific and narrower topics that will lead to our conversation. So I'm Sheila Warren. I'm the CEO of the Crypto Council for Innovation. I co-host a podcast on the CoinDesk network called Money Reimagined that looks at the inclusive future and potential around crypto and the Web3 ecosystem. A little bit about CCI. We're a global alliance advancing crypto innovation with a frame on inclusive growth. So we believe in leading with a global worldview. So the global technology, not one that should be dominated by developed countries or first world economies, as they're so-called. Very so-called. We advocate for inclusive regulation, want to make sure that the regulatory models that come in and policy that gets put into place that governs Web3 and the crypto ecosystem does not either mirror or replicate the stratification and bias and inequities of existing legacy systems. And if we port my fundamental belief is if we port the existing regulations directly over into new spaces, we're simply going to port over all of the problems that we know exist in those existing systems and make it very difficult, if not impossible, to build better and to do more with the knowledge that we already have about what does not work. We look at actionable and evidence-based insights around things like where have we seen activation, whether it's in the human rights ecosystem, whether it's in civil rights, civil liberties, where are these under threat, and where can the new Web3 Web3 way of thinking and the ecosystem that we're all building together actually proved to catalyze social change and social justice. And all of that belies the importance of working together in partnership with policymakers to do a lot of education and make sure that we don't lose the fundamental tenets of this new world order that we're building, this new idea where each of us has more control and agency within systems we have not prior had. By way of background, I led the World Economic Forum's blockchain agenda. I was the founder of that team, which had a big focus on financial inclusion and inclusive growth. And I spent a decade before that in civic tech. So this is all very important to me. Now, I want to say a couple of things to land a couple of points before we get into our conversation. One is, I think it's really obvious we're at an inflection point with centralized institutions, be that government, media, tech platforms, legacy financial, whatever it is. There are very obvious fundamental issues with trust, control, and ownership in very private, very important, critical areas of our lives. We're in a time of acute crisis around the world, where autonomy and focus on human rights are becoming, and civil liberties becoming of more and more importance and more prominent in our discussion. Nowhere is that more true, I would argue, at this current moment than in the United States, where we're seeing the erosion of civil liberties at a very rapid scale that's unprecedented, at least in my lifetime. But as long as we're beholden to centralized entities that control our critical infrastructure, again, whether that is legacy web, legacy financial systems, even the government, I don't believe that real fundamental social change is going to be possible. I think that the surveillance systems that we're all under, whether or not we're aware of those systems, make it increasingly challenging, difficult, and dangerous to be an activist in these times. And that is true, frankly, everywhere in the world. There really aren't exceptions. And the data, I think, speaks for itself in terms of why these systems are so important around Web3. Financial inclusion alone, inclusive growth. 20% of US adults do not have access to basic financial services, 20%, okay? And according to the FDIC's recent survey of household banking, don't trust banks was a reason that 16.1% of these households do not have an account. It's the second most cited reason, the first being access. We can already see how crypto and Web3 are providing alternatives to those who have not been served by these systems. And they're building in a way that is about empowerment and focused on users, not focused on the systems themselves or the institutions that are enabling or gatekeeping access to those systems, okay? So that's just one example. We know that around the world, as human rights activists have recently highlighted, Bitcoin, stable coins, crypto, these are critically important infrastructure layer to anybody who's living under an unstable economy or authoritarian regime. Examples from Afghanistan, Venezuela, Ukraine, Gaza, like all over the world, all over the continent of Africa, different parts of LATAM, subparts of Colombia, Mexico. You're just seeing tremendous engagement with these in the activism space with these technologies and with the value exchange that they enable, which again is proving to be a lifeline for these people at a time when you can't trust systems to not be cut off, whether the companies want to or not in some cases. You can't trust them to not share your information, your private identifying information, your PII, with those who would do you harm, frankly. It's also about consumer choice and about having financial freedom, which I think is core to civil liberties and to economic freedom is a precursor for social freedom in many ways. It enables people to engage in those fights. And where you see crypto adoption is very telling. In the top 20 countries for crypto adoption, the US is the only very, very high income country. Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Ukraine, and Kenya are in the top 5 spots. I think that's very revealing personally. We can't underestimate, my last point, the importance of fundraising in this space. The ability to channel money directly to activists on the front lines is critically important. And even beyond activism, I'll give you 2 examples from the very recent past, hopefully not the recent future, but sure to be as well. One is the fact that we witnessed in real time the crowdfunding of a wartime defense, of a bridge before international communities could come together with aid for Ukraine. We saw crypto wallets prove to be catalytic in enabling that defense to happen at the time of the Russian invasion. We also saw tremendous outpouring to India during COVID-19 for relief that was able to go directly to local institutions to help support villages, to help support people in the field that weren't getting served by big multinational institutions that were not so motivated. So again, I'll end by saying we're seeing erosion of civil rights and liberties all over the world. And my belief is as long as we're beholden to centralized entities, whether relief agencies, aid agencies, whether it's legacy financial institutions, Web2 platforms, I don't think we can achieve real social change at a sustainable and scalable way as long as that is the world in which we're operating. And my hope is that by engaging more deeply with Web3, we'll usher in a new world where we can have more engagement from more people that is meaningful to them, that can be hyper-localized to build responses to situations that are resonant and that are reflective of what actual need is on the ground. So thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. And next we'll hear from Abraham.
Hey, thanks. So as Leah mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of issues and possibilities with future regulation being discussed, but I'm going to focus on something that's already with us. And it was something that came with the infrastructure bill, which was passed last summer, signed into law last November. And it's a provision that didn't get considerable attention. Of course, nothing did during the debate leading up to the infrastructure bill passage. And this one took some time for its significance to sink in, and some thanks there to Fight for the Future for their interest and attention to this once it became clear. And I'm referring to a tiny amendment, just 8 words long, that was added to an obscure provision in the tax code, known as tax code section 6050I, which added digital assets to the definition of cash for purposes of a reporting provision that most of us simply weren't familiar with because of the nature of the cash that until this amendment it regulated. And following that passage into law, there were indeed a couple of efforts to repeal it. 2 bills introduced in Congress that would have repealed this never debated, never discussed amendment. And then, as Leah also mentioned recently, a few weeks ago, Coin Center, which I'm affiliated with, has announced a lawsuit to challenge this provision in the courts. But I actually really want to focus on the statute itself, because one of the challenges we deal with in the area of financial regulation and these issues which have such an effect on kind of our First Amendment protected activist and activism related activities is the nature of this regulation is often so obscure and detailed and remote from our experience. And it's only with that understanding of how these provisions work in the bigger picture. Hopefully I'll have some time to speak about a little bit about the Bank Secrecy Act, which is a player in this here in the United States. But I want to focus on these details so people are aware of it, really what's going on. So what this provision did is it created a surveillance and reporting requirement applicable basically to all Americans. It's based on those who receive digital assets. And it says when you receive digital assets over a threshold, which I'll talk about, you are obliged on pain of a felony to collect and indeed verify and report the personal information of the person on the other side of that transaction to the IRS. This within 15 days. Now, again, this provision comes from a little known 1984 provision applicable to physical cash. We're talking cash transactions occurring inside the United States, and the obscurity of that provision and the rarity of which that was applied in real life is one reason why this extension of this principle to digital assets failed to get more attention. But again, it requires people, who in any business activity receive these digital assets to record, to obtain in the first place this information and to report it to the government for use in, well, frankly, any type of criminal investigation, even though this is technically a tax code provision. Part of the story of why this wasn't immediately appreciated, which is why I want to emphasize how it works, is the nature of the statute and the requirements it imposes do not fit with cryptocurrency and distributed digital asset technology. The statute speaks about receiving assets. It assumes that certain things are clear, which are indeed clear if you're talking about physical cash, but are not clear or well-defined or easy for us to get our heads around where this will apply in the case of digital assets. So for example, to take one of many, it assumes that there's a receipt and it assumes that there's a natural person who does that receiving and who can know when they're received exactly. That's what starts the clock to file this mandatory report within 15 days. And again, unlike all other provisions in the tax code or similar reporting provisions, this one's been singled out for violations to be regarded as felonies as opposed to misdemeanors. So the technology doesn't fit with the underlying statute. And I'll speak also to the threshold. So the threshold in the statute is $10,000, and this figure goes back as far as 1970, or even when the original 6050I was passed in 1984 was significantly higher. But a key thing that's important to see with digital assets, due to the nature of blockchain and the way records are kept, that threshold will in fact end up being much lower than that, because related transactions and payments on a transaction all count toward that threshold. And that's a fact that doesn't really matter, practically speaking, with cash transactions, which of course nobody does at that level anyways, but will require those to be recorded. So it's not as though there's a clear line which will allow people who want to avoid that statute to steer clear from the surveillance and reporting responsibility. One final note on this overview. This is a tax code statute, but it interacts in interesting ways that require a lot of attention with the Bank Secrecy Act, which has its own set of reporting obligations, including for financial institutions, which is very similar to this one, but totally different. The only businesses in the United States that are exempt from this 6050I requirement are banks and financial institutions. And that's because they're subject to their own reporting requirements. And while some of these are in the pike and we will expect them soon, it's important to see what this means for the use of digital assets, because this statute will pressure transactions back through these financial institutions in order to relieve you and I from these reporting obligations. And so seeing how that interacts with the Bank Secrecy Act is a critical piece of seeing how this will work in practice. I'll wrap up there.
Thanks, Abe. I just wanted to remind anyone who's just coming in that you can ask questions in the chat or through the Q&A function, but I'm going to hand it over now to Stefen.
Sure, thanks. Just for context, the Caribbean Blockchain Alliance is a nonprofit that's been focused on blockchain adoption in the Caribbean region, mainly through education. We've done a lot of education over the years. We've also done a lot of just public policy engagement, engaging with governments and regulators and central banks just to promote basically the embracing of Web3 and blockchain technologies. So on a personal note, the reason why I became so passionate about this tech to begin with is because a number of years back, I was very interested in fintech. I saw what was happening. I really wanted to, bring that into the Bahamas, where I'm from, and into the Caribbean. And I realized very quickly that that was impossible, because a lot of the ostensible promises of fintech weren't actually possible. So if you think of things like Cash App, Stripe, all these different apps and protocols that a lot of people take for granted, especially in the US, they are not accessible, not available to most of the Caribbean, and of course many parts of the global South. And when I started to understand how blockchains work, how crypto worked, I realized, oh, this is actually the thing that can bring the entirety of not just the Caribbean region, but also the global South into the global economy. It allows us to actually access the global economy in ways that we just weren't able to before. And that's why this technology is critical for me and for us in our region. Something interesting that happened recently, I'm sure you've all seen it. There was a letter written by a number of technologists that was focused on, basically heavily regulating, or even to some degree shutting down as much as possible this industry. And of course, if you look at the demographic of the authors of this letter, it was largely white males in the US and the UK and all Western Europe in general. And then another letter was drafted by a number of people from human rights organizations and allies. And if you look at the demographic there, it was completely global. It was much different. And I thought that was a very powerful moment to show exactly, why we're here, why we're actually focused on this global technology. And just like Sheila said already, that we've already seen so much empowerment and use throughout the world, especially in parts of Africa, but also, of course, the Caribbean, Latin America, We've seen actual liberation of women and young girls in Afghanistan. And that's something that just hasn't been possible in a lot of ways, especially in the areas of money and finance and all these different things. And where it comes back to the US regulation side is that we've seen in a lot of ways that US regulation often becomes global regulation, either directly or indirectly, which shows that what the US does will have a massive effect on what the rest of the world does in a lot of ways, especially if you look at something that not just the Caribbean again, but the global South needs in general, remittances, such a massive thing that could actually be greatly hurt and hampered by what the US decides to do. And also, of course, on-ramps and off-ramps, because a lot of, the VASP regulation and whatnot will end up coming from the US in a lot of ways. So whatever the US decides to do, it will have massive effects on what the rest of the world decides to do and how the rest of the world can actually access this technology. I'll wrap up there.
Thank you, Stefen. And now we'll move on to Evan.
Cool. Hey, everyone. And thanks so much for being here. Sorry, I had to turn off my video for a second to deal with a little home situation, but been listening in. And yeah, it's so important that we have these kind of conversations to really get into the details, because as Stefen just mentioned, I think there's just so much oversimplification that happens in how we talk about this, both in terms of the technology itself, the promise of it, the applications, and then certainly in the policies that are needed to effectively govern it and protect people. And I guess I'll start by just saying I'm perhaps like the resident crypto skeptic on the call, in the sense that I believe profoundly and strongly in the principles of decentralization. And I believe that a blockchain is one mechanism for organizing decentralized software projects, but not necessarily the only one. And so for Fight for the Future, we really try to focus our advocacy around looking holistically at decentralized open source software projects and how we can protect the rights of people to create and use them. So we're less involved in kind of saying like this mechanism for organizing software projects is better than this one, but rather we want to protect the right of people and organizations to make that decision for themselves and experiment and try to figure out how to solve some of the problems that have persisted before digital technology and will persist long after it, in terms of how we as humans organize ourselves, make decisions, et cetera. And so for me, when I think about policy, I think there's sort of two categories. One is, what is bad policy? What are things that we know are not okay and are harmful? What are red lines that should never be crossed? And for us as a civil liberties and human rights organization, we always look to center impact on the most marginalized and vulnerable in how we think about policies. So first, talking about sort of just a do no harm of that, we should always make sure if government or any other type of institution with arbitrary power is going to exercise that power, that we start with a principle of not making things worse or potentially causing collateral damage as we try to address real harms or problems or issues. Secondarily, for us is defending and protecting the fundamental right to code. That recognizing that code is a form of speech, people should have a right to write whatever code they want, to run whatever code they want. That doesn't mean that they have the right to harm other people or use code in ways that could do harm, but people should have a fundamental right to write code, and we should never accept policies that criminalize the simple act of writing software code or running software code on a device that you own. And then beyond that, we want to avoid any policies that undermine the potential of technologies to preserve privacy and circumvent censorship. So we recognize that decentralized technologies broadly, whether it's an open source project like Tor, as Leah mentioned earlier, or something like Mastodon or Element, these have applications and functions. If we look at cryptocurrencies as well, particularly privacy coins, et cetera, we can see applications and functions that Stefen was just talking about. These don't come without risks or other problems that new technologies can create. But when we talk about policy, whether you think these technologies are good or bad, we should all agree that we want policies that actually make sense and that don't disproportionately harm people who've been harmed by the kind of failed institutions that have led us up until this point. So for me, I think to kind of give some concrete examples, right? My impression from a lot of folks who are very skeptical of crypto or very anti-crypto, including some of the folks that signed the letter that Stefen was just mentioning, is that they perceive the risk of people being swindled out of their money as like the paramount risk. It's like the worst thing they can imagine in the world. And I understand that people getting scammed out of their money is like a real problem and impacts particularly marginalized and low-income people the most. For me, I worry a lot more about arbitrary power of government, corporations, and institutions to silence social movements. I worry about the impact of government surveillance on marginalized communities. And I worry about the failure of centralized institutions to take care of people in moments of crisis. And so I think we need to balance those concerns and to the extent that there are real problems, which there absolutely are, we need to look at those problems through a lens of consumer protection, through privacy, through security. I think in a lot of ways, when we talk about how do we regulate Web3, I always sort of say like, we haven't even gotten our act together to regulate Web2. Congress in the United States still hasn't passed a federal data privacy law. And that affects Facebook just as much as it affects Coinbase. And so I just think it's really important that we don't become too exceptionalist. And perhaps this is a bit of a product of the crypto space. The crypto space and many folks within it sort of can be a little bit exceptionalist in how we talk about crypto. And I think that has led to policymakers thinking like, oh, we need like a totally different set of policies to deal with privacy and security concerns that relate to crypto. When in fact, if they just got off their butts and actually passed some of the basic data privacy laws that they've been dragging their feet on for years, or things like cybersecurity incident reporting, that could actually address a lot of the things that people are pointing to as problems in the crypto space, like scams or hacks or people getting their money stolen. And so for me, I think there absolutely is regulation needed in the same way that there is with any technology. We need policies that protect people from scams. We need policies that hold companies and institutions accountable if they're not living up to their promises, especially around things like privacy and security. But those policies need to be constitutional. They need to not undermine people's basic right to code, and they need to not mandate or attempt to mandate that people collect data or information that they would not otherwise collect. One example of that was the provisions in the infrastructure bill, which I think have already been mentioned, that would have effectively coerced people into participating in surveillance on behalf of the government. For us at Fight for the Future, that's a red line. We are more than happy with consumer protection or policies that crack down on bad actors in the space. We have to fight tooth and nail against provisions and policies that could lead to undermining people's basic human rights, expanding government surveillance, or undermining free expression. So at a high level, that's kind of why we're in the fight, why we care, and what our red lines are. And I think, again, for me, this is about like creating the space and being a little bit humble. I think we all need to be a little bit humble and say, like, we don't know what technologies are going to be needed to solve the problems in our world. And in fact, technology alone is not going to solve any of the problems in our world. It's going to be part of the solution and or part of the problem. And either way, it's going to come down to how do we as humans make some real decisions about technology and the role that it plays in our society, and what policies and protections are needed to ensure that technology is largely a force for good and empowerment and upliftment rather than a force for tyranny and greed and exploitation.
Thank you so much, Evan, and everyone. This is already really awesome, and we still have a half an hour for Q&A. So if you chose to join us via Zoom, you can ask your questions right now. We also have collected a whole bunch of questions for you all already. And so let's get started. I think I'll toss this one to start to Sheila, but anyone else feel free to hop in as well. Can you give us some specific examples of how the Web3 way of thinking that you mentioned is promoting human rights today, or the Web3 way of doing, perhaps?
Yeah. So I'll piggyback off some of the content that Stefen was alluding to around use cases that we've seen in various parts of the world. And so I think that exists in the provision of services. And I'll take the example of financial services. It's kind of an easy one to understand, and people associate crypto fairly or unfairly. I think it's reasonable with financial services and with payments and with money and with all that kind of stuff. So if you look at places where you have what are called unbanked or underbanked people, I personally don't like that term. I use the term historically excluded people because they are people who've systematically been, because of the Bank Secrecy Act that Abe mentioned, and for other reasons, largely of which are policy or regulatory in nature, KYC, AML, they do not have access to basic services. So if you look at places like that, we've already seen Caribbean islands are included here. You've seen this in Central African Republic. You've seen it. El Salvador is an example that people, it's controversial, but nevertheless, it is a real example of places where you had systems that were not functioning for basic kinds of payments, basic kinds of abilities to store value, ability to transact and exchange, ability to hedge against inflation. There are parts of the world where this is very real and very active. I think there are also parts of the world I forget who it was, I think it was Stefen again, who talked about where activists have used Bitcoin specifically to basically engage in dangerous activities deemed dangerous by the government. North Korea, Afghanistan, Syria, Sudan. I mean, there are places that, Venezuela. These are places where Bitcoin is a tool, and I say Bitcoin very specifically, Bitcoin has been a tool of actually getting funding to activists on the ground who are engaging in whatever it might be, protests, different kinds of actions, different kinds of, whether it's marches, whether it's getting people out of jail, whether it's bail money, whether it's whatever it is, like all these kinds of things that you need. So perhaps it's helpful to kind of frame this around context. So I have engaged in activist causes for most of my adult life. I'm currently part of the ACLU. I did a lot of work in reproductive justice, earlier in my career. And so a lot of what is needed there is funding, it's money. And it's money that can move to people without being traced or tracked, without being able to be hacked or stolen. And in the past, people were delivering packets of cash, like literally just taking packets of cash around the world, delivering to other people and calling it a day. That's extraordinarily dangerous activity. And what Bitcoin and crypto, in some cases, Ethereum specifically, have done is make that a safer activity, make it an activity that can ensure that that funding gets in the hands of the person that's intended to go to. It's then distributed in a fashion that is furthering whatever the causes everyone's trying to support. Those are things that were not really possible in the past. And you went from kind of crossing your fingers and doing this to being able to actually ensure that that is done in a much more safe way without the tremendous personal cost of the courier who is taking that funding across the border or even into a part of the United States. So those are things that I think are often called edge cases by advertise it. And in my mind, I feel like the gaps we had in traditional financial systems and the inability to support those kinds of activities was hugely problematic. And again, as I noted in my opener, I don't think that you can rely on centralized institutions that are beholden to the government via surveillance mechanisms that are very active to engage in these kinds of activities that in my mind are critical to the promotion of democracy and civil rights. So those are concrete examples and we can drill down, but I'd recommend the Human Rights Foundation's documented a lot of this stuff. They have it on I think it's on their website. You can look at a lot of content they've put out. They've done a bunch of use case collection and studies. When I was at the World Economic Forum, we did some case studies around this as well in our Crypto What Is It Good For lookbook that we created. So there are a lot of places to find this content in addition to what I just said as a kind of giving you a frame.
All right, I'll toss this next one to Abe to start, but again, anyone can jump in who would like to answer it. So we've heard that many people don't trust banks, but I'm wondering, what do you think is needed to help people who don't trust banks to trust some of these new financial options? And I think we can kind of share this around, but Abe, I'll start with you.
Well, good question. I mean, I would say the first thing is to maintain this as an option and not prematurely break it off. And that's the emphasis here. And comparing this with what Sheila was saying, finance is very complicated, and the pure peer-to-peer example is very different from anything that touches banks. And this requires details about how the Bank Secrecy Act works and how these institutions are regulated. And that's why 6050I needs to, these details about it are very important. It specifically goes after a loophole, right? A loophole being defined as something that's not covered under the Bank Secrecy Act, and that is true peer-to-peer technology. And one of the challenges is, or one of the facts is, there's not a lot of true peer-to-peer use of assets. There's reasons why we use intermediaries for convenience and other reasons. But what this provision is going to do is put a serious weight on even the potential use for actual peer-to-peer transactions. And as I emphasized earlier, thereby kind of strongly encouraging them back through bank and financial institution mediated transactions, which are already subject to a far more developed and complete reporting apparatus and crime prevention apparatus. And that's why I think it's so critical to see this for what it is, as we look, as we're still waiting for more of those uses to be developed. Now, on this call, and for the kind of purposes behind Amnesty's work and some of the activism work that we're discussing, those uses are more clear, right? These edge cases where the benefits and the potentials are already being seen, or the importance of actual peer-to-peer transactions, perhaps replacing, as Sheila mentioned, a delivery of cash somewhere 3/4 of the way around the world. So that's what I want to emphasize, how this provision and the challenges to it are really critical for maintaining the possibility of transactional privacy through true peer-to-peer. Not to discount at all kind of the bigger picture of these existing systems under the Bank Secrecy Act and elsewhere, but this one needs to be seen for what it is, which is a direct challenge to the idea of peer-to-peer transactions.
And I just want to add to that and answer the question a different way. I actually think the reason that a lot of communities, so I think there's exclusion at an individual level, a community level, and a country level. Okay, so when you look at like the banking system around the world, you've got cases where an individual was not able to access financial services because they had a name that, you know, was on the no-fly list or whatever, which wasn't even real, but it was just considered too risky to engage with them and do all the diligence to ensure that they were not the individual intended, right? So that kind of is one example. You had communities. So there's a history of redlining in this country, in the United States, which exists in other places around the world, where you're a member of a certain community, usually a marginalized community or minority community. You just don't get access to services because of overt racism, bias, whatever it is. And then you have country level exclusion, where correspondent banking systems, as correspondent banks, including over the pandemic, just vanished, just basically pulled out of certain jurisdictions. The fees to get money from point A to point B requires you to hop through a number of different banks or countries or whatever it is, which becomes extraordinarily expensive to do. And so, you know, through the lack of access and the lack of kind of opportunities in services, you created a fee structure that just made it impossible. So the exclusion happens at all these different levels. And so these communities, individuals, you know, countries, et cetera, have to be centered and deliberately included in the conversation, in the design, in the build, and all of these things. And without that intentionality, I don't know why you would have trust, quite frankly. I'm not sure why anybody would trust these systems. And so I think what we're seeing is, in addition to the peer-to-peer engagement, which people are trusting, they trust their own, right? They trust that the other individual is someone that they know, they can engage through a system that they don't have to worry is gatekeeping for them, because it's not gatekeeping. At least not in ways that are traditionally kind of done. I think that helps, but I also think that centering these communities in these systems is really important. I co-founded something called Cradle, the Crypto Research and Design Lab, which is using tech ethnography to identify, can this technology be useful? To Evan's point, technology is not a solution. It is part of it's a potential solution in the right enabling environment. And that enabling environment involves design, it involves user interface, it involves policy and regulation, like all these different things. But all of it comes down to, is that community, is that person, is that, you know, country, whatever it is the excluded community now being included, or is it an afterthought and something that, you know, well, we'll get around to them after we've built our core use case, then we'll get around to kind of including it to other people. And if you have that, I think you're just replicating what hasn't worked before and what is never going to work, because you have to be intentional about all of this if your goal is to gain trust. But more importantly, if your goal is to actually be useful and meet needs, you have to know what those needs are. And you can't just kind of, you know, after the fact, try to shove them into something that wasn't fit for purpose.
Great answers, y'all. Thank you so much. yeah, so if you're joining us via Zoom, you have multiple options, chat or Q&A if you would like to ask questions, or you have a bunch collected. So we'll just keep on rolling, but feel free to pitch in. So to be a little bit current eventy, I'll ask, one of the big promises of cryptocurrencies in particular seems to be anonymity, or like pseudo-anonymity. And thinking about the potential deplatforming of, for example, abortion funds here in the US, alongside the criminalization of aiding abortion, is regulation needed to ensure that people who might use cryptocurrencies are not endangered by false or sloppy marketing promises coming from some projects around anonymity and protecting user data specifically? And anybody can take that.
Well, I'll just give a brief answer. I think the concern is we shouldn't focus on regulation to protect. Our bigger concern is regulation that will make it impossible or will do the opposite. And that's a big part of this, because with blockchain, once transactions and parties and personal identification is connected to an account, that does enable a degree of, even if it's not the transaction you're concerned about that was reported, it provides access through chain analysis to that. So it opens up a wide view on unrelated transactions. Further, to address your concern about lack of privacy, because obviously here blockchain is a double-edged sword. So I would just say let's focus on not handing over all of those tools to enable that type of surveillance first.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off that and say it in a slightly different way, just so people who may not be as familiar with the technology kind of understand, because it's an important point, right? So right now, there are certain transactions that are exempted from, reporting or other kinds of things, right? And I'm talking globally now. In some parts of the world, like if you're over a certain threshold, then there's reporting that kicks in, whatever it might look like, right? Diligence, other things that kick in. The reality, though, is once you know who a wallet belongs to, you know who a wallet belongs to. And the entire history of whatever that wallet did is visible on chain, right? Through an on-chain explorer. And so it doesn't matter if every transaction you make for years is under a threshold or doesn't have to be, whatever it is. The minute that one is, everything else is visible, whether or not it was subject to surveillance or not, right? So that's just something really important to remember for anyone who's thinking about using any digital wallet or crypto wallet for any kinds of purposes. The other thing I just want to say, that's just a different way of saying what Abe said and why some of the things that he's been talking about are so important, or so critically important when it comes to what is the precedent we're setting around access to information that can tag and identify the ownership of a particular digital asset via wallet. The other thing to note, I think, is that there is a significant difference between anonymity and pseudonymity. And in many cases, pseudonymity is not the droid you're looking for. Like, it is not necessarily what you think it is. And so be very aware of that, right? So I might go on Twitter and have a profile that's not my name. Please don't go looking for it. I'm very much me on the Bird app, but someone knows who that is, and that's Twitter. And so it is very possible for, under subpoena, et cetera, the identity to actually be revealed to a government for cases of criminal prosecution, whatever it is. Whether we get there with abortion or not is an open question. I think we have to see how this plays. But certainly, I do think in some states, you're going to see there are already laws in the books that basically say abetting or aiding in the provision of an abortion is illegal. And that includes, presumably, the sending of funds. And so if you're using something where your name is known, then there is a possibility that could be subpoenaed, and the information could be, depending on the category of crime, could actually be forced to be revealed. And I think it's just really, really important to keep that in mind. So that's less about answering your question, Leah. More, I just think it's an important frame for those who might be listening to understand the nature and reality of why I think you're sensing so much, why this is such an acute crisis that we're facing right now in the United States, which, by the way, has been acute in other parts of the world for quite a long time, but we're now feeling it in a different way, I think, here too.
I'll just say very quickly, I completely agree with everything said. And to be completely honest, I'm much more worried about, much less sure of regulation being able to help consumers and users in this situation, and much more likely for it to be used to further harm or further surveil users in this situation. So.
Yeah, and if I could quickly jump in, I guess this is one of those situations where the inefficiency of government is probably our friend, in the sense that, like, I'd be shocked if they got together any kind of regulations, good or bad, quickly in this moment. And so for me, I guess I would speak more directly to people in the crypto industry and in the crypto space and say, like, this is not a moment to be like replying to people's posts saying Bitcoin fixes this. If you want to help, like, raise money and send it to abortion funds and people who are on the ground doing the work, who are very familiar with the privacy and surveillance risks and have protocols in place. You know, when technologies are newer and experimental, you know, that comes with risks, even if that risk is just human error on the part of the person using it. And so from my perspective, like, the thing that people in the space can be doing right now is raising a shit ton of money and getting it to the groups on the front lines, led predominantly by Black and brown folks on the ground in states where abortion is being criminalized. And like, that's how you can help if you want to help.
Again, great answers. Thank you all so much. We have about 13 minutes left. And so, Stefen, I'll toss it to you. It seems as if those with a lot of economic privilege really have difficulty valuing the utility of emerging technologies, you know, like blockchain and cryptocurrency. And I'm just wondering, how can folks with a lot of privilege do better? And who should we be listening to? And learning from in order to inform some of the analysis that we're making?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, at the end of the day, it really all comes down to listening to people who don't look like you and aren't from places where you are. There are so many organizations globally that are focused on, you know, whether it's embracing of Web3 and crypto, or even just human rights in general. It's so easy to, at least from my perspective, it's so easy to find what's going on the ground. So for example, I always commit the grave error of responding to criticisms on Twitter, for example. But a lot of times it becomes so clear. I remember someone saying remittances aren't a real thing, and it absolutely blew my mind. So yeah, just like you said, there's such a massive misunderstanding of contexts and nuances. I don't know if I have a better answer than just like pay attention to and look for other organizations, look for things that have been written, look for what they're doing. And that's really the first step at the end of the day, because if you look at the statistics, I believe this is probably outdated. But the estimate is that maybe around 300 million people use crypto. I don't know like how actively or to what extent. We realize I mean, on the grand scheme of things, it's not a massive number, but it's much more than most people expect. Like, everyone talks about, you know, crypto bros, but 300 million obviously includes a lot of people and a lot of people globally. So I think starting from there and trying to understand, okay, how are other people using it? How have people in Nigeria, for example, used it? That there are a lot of headlines, there are a lot of like articles that have been written about these things. So I think just actually stepping out of your comfort zone, stepping out to read and find out what happened or what's happening is the most important part.
Thanks so much, Stefen. My next question goes to Evan. Why is it that so many regulations we've seen proposed recently compromise basic human rights? And what would you say legislators need to do differently to get this right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing that's been very helpful for me in kind of decrypting some of what's coming from the Hill on this is that none of this is particularly new. You know, Fight for the Future spends a lot of our time working around issues like Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which lawmakers from both parties widely misunderstand and have repeatedly attacked, despite the fact that most of the changes they're proposing would make most of the problems that they're identifying worse rather than better. Similarly, with end-to-end encryption, we've seen lawmakers across the political spectrum, policymakers around the world, attacking what is a foundational technology for human rights and free expression, because people can use that technology to do harm, which is true of any technology in many ways. And so for us, it's not a new experience to see two types of regulations, one that are kind of malicious, like where lawmakers are intentionally trying to do harm. I would argue the anti-abortion laws sweeping the country are very much in that vein. And then laws that are well-intentioned but misguided. So for example, with Section 230, something like the Safe Tech Act, which is trying to incentivize tech platforms to do a better job at content moderation, but in practice, if it were in effect today, would likely lead to widespread censorship of online content about abortion access. And obviously I'm putting it in that context just because that is at top of mind for all of us right now. But you could extrapolate that out to any number of other issues. And so it's not unique to the crypto space, which maybe that's like gives us a little hope, like, because I think sometimes folks in the crypto world can just feel like, this is all coming down on us. And, ask anybody who's tried to run a decent, any kind of alternative social media platform, et cetera. And like, they will tell you they've had some of the same problems with lack of understanding and with kind of a disinterest in understanding in a lot of parts. So one of the things specifically, though, that I think has been happening with the crypto space is that because, as Sheila mentioned, this is broadly seen as financial and related to financial instruments, financial markets, and kind of financial applications, most of the folks within congressional offices or the regulatory agencies that are approaching this are people with a strictly financial background. And so they have a hammer and they are looking at crypto, and crypto looks a lot like a nail, and they want to hit crypto with their hammer. And that makes a lot of sense. There are aspects of crypto that very much are a nail and that they probably should hit with their hammer, or at least they should try to figure out which piece of it to hit with what size hammer. But what they are often not seeing is the vast non-financial applications for blockchains and the ways that they interact, where there are entire decentralized projects that do have a small financial component, but where that's not the primary thrust of it. So you think of something like Filecoin providing decentralized file storage and using a digital token as a way to kind of incentivize that and govern it essentially, or create a transparent democratic governance structure for what is essentially an alternative to Amazon Web Services. A financial regulator has no idea how to deal with something like that. That is clearly not a stock. It's not a bond. It's not a dollar. It's not a currency. They have no clue. And so they're just like, well, I don't know. It looks kind of like a nail. Let's hit it. Right. And so a big problem that is happening is just that we need more conversation between people who are tech experts, who are tech policy experts, who are privacy experts, who are speech experts, who are human rights experts, and people who are financial experts and experts in consumer protection and experts in things like cybersecurity and money laundering, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, it's like the room just has a bunch of dudes in suits who are worried about financial crimes. And that is the only lens that they're looking at this technology through. And because of that, they're missing this entire ecosystem that has nothing to do with financial anything, much less financial crimes specifically. So from what I would say that, how we get to a better policy landscape is by having more voices in the mix, so that policymakers are thinking about this holistically. And, the people who are experts in the finance piece can try to figure out what the types of targeted interventions are to address harms there, while there are human rights experts saying, oh, but don't do that because that would have this negative effect over here, right? And often just having that visibility is really, really important for avoiding catastrophic regulation that does more harm than good.
Great. Okay, we have 5 minutes left. So in these last 5 minutes, I just want quick 30 seconds or less from each of you. Are there policies or safeguards that you'd like to see, maybe choose one, in this space in the near future? And let's go Sheila, Stefen, Evan, Abe.
Sure. So I would like to see the cessation, it's kind of a broad thing, a cessation of singling out of cryptocurrencies specifically within the financial ecosystem. To kind of go to Evan's point, I'll target like what's really being targeted right now. Particularly where there are other safeguards already in place. Example is the Department of Labor coming after Bitcoin as part of a retirement portfolio when you already have a lot of checks and balances on fiduciary obligations and responsibilities of those who construct retirement portfolios as a general matter. We're seeing this all over the place, the singling out of this particular offering as being of such risk severity, that it needs its own, I think Evan talked about this too, its own either black and white, like kill it altogether, or its own very prescribed set of regulations that are only looking at it in the financial, in one very even narrow financial orientation to it, rather than looking at the innovation potential and the surface area of what could actually happen here if it were allowed to thrive. So the singling out of this as somehow dangerously unique from other things that are actually quite risky themselves, I think is what I would like to see.
Awesome, yeah, and we've obviously covered a lot, so I'll just reiterate, any regulation that will, affect remittances and maybe on-ramps and off-ramps will be extremely devastating to massive chunks of the world. So let's be careful about that. I'll also add really quickly, since we didn't touch on it, just the easy embrace of DAO structures, these decentralized autonomous organizations, because what we will see in that regard is a lot of use in very small and very underserved communities that are going to use these new type of organizational structures to, do mutual aid, to empower each other. So that's going to be really important as well, to just make sure that's as easily accessible even to the smallest individual, the most underserved communities as possible.
My short answer is no new policy safeguards. Let's focus on stopping or reversing the steps in the wrong direction. Far more important right now.
Sorry, Evan?
Yeah, so I mean, I will sort of gently disagree there, just because I think that the situation that we're in suggests that in a vacuum, we're going to just continue getting the worst type of regulation. And so I do think it is crucial for our space to start to be proactive and put forward, well, what do we think policies are needed to address the real harms that people are identifying? Because while I would agree that some of those harms have been inflated, or perhaps people are kind of deprioritizing one type of harm while obsessing about a different type of harm, there are real harms. And we're not going to get away with kind of trying to paint over them or ignore them. And so from my perspective, where Fight for the Future is zeroed in here is, one, to look at this through a consumer protection lens. And I would agree with Sheila that generally speaking, those policies should be crafted in a technology agnostic manner. Like, for example, cybersecurity incident reporting, which would affect Equifax and Target just as much as Coinbase and Kraken, would be hugely helpful in this moment, and would address things like ensuring that companies have basic precautions in place to inform people if they've had a breach. That isn't a crypto specific policy, but that is a policy that would address one type of harm that has been identified within the crypto space. Privacy legislation, I already mentioned. And I think beyond that, just getting more agencies involved in a thoughtful manner. I think from where I'm sitting, this is all very new, and clearly we're all just beginning to understand it. Policymakers are miles behind most of the folks on this call, much less, even folks that are trying to draft or craft legislation. And so I would urge also just more study. I actually thought that the Biden administration's executive order was largely positive in the sense that it called for a lot of different study and investigation to look at, how this stuff is being used and the various different applications, the pros, the cons, the pitfalls. More of that, I think, is needed. I would like to see some of that happening through an explicit human rights, racial, social, economic justice lens. I would love to see, for example, a bill like the Safe Sex Workers Study Act, which refers to Section 230 and would require the US government to do a study of Sesta Fosta, a bill that amended Section 230, to determine what the public health impact of that law was. I would love to see something similar for crypto, where we look at, task some federal agencies with doing a real study on the impact that these technologies have on, for example, global human rights, or in countries where there are repressive regimes. That's the type of stuff that I think would lead to better, more informed policy. But I do think that we need targeted interventions. And one thing I'll also mention is, obviously environmental issues have been raised quite a bit by folks in the crypto skeptic and anti-crypto crowd. Our take there is that, Fight for the Future, half of us used to be climate activists. We're still climate activists. We do a lot of work in this area. We support pretty much any legislation that restricts or shuts down fossil fuel burning power plants. But from where we're sitting, again, those policies ideally would be technology agnostic. But we support, for example, the moratorium in New York, where we basically felt, well, this is essentially regulating fossil fuels in themselves, not crypto. And that's sort of been our message around the environmental issues of, if you're concerned about energy use, then regulate fossil fuels rather than what code people can and can't write. And so that's kind of where we're approaching things from on that front.
Thanks. I'll just hop on now to say a big thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. It's been great hearing from you and learning from you. And to all our guests for joining us. A recording of this will be available on YouTube to share with anyone who wasn't able to make it. And yeah, stay tuned for our next event and hope to run into you somewhere else. Bye, everyone.
And thank you all so much.